Perfect. Welcome to the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy webinar. I'm Dr. Cassandra Crifasi, Deputy Director of the Center, and I'm so pleased that you've joined us today. Our speaker, Dr. Thomas Gabor, is going to be presenting on mass shootings, trends, patterns, and prevention. Dr. Gabor was a professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa, Canada, from 1981 through 2011, and is currently the president of Thomas Gabor LLC, a criminal justice consulting firm based in Florida. Dr. Gabor is a nationally and internationally recognized expert on firearms and public safety, armed robbery, and crime prevention. He's published over 200 books, research reports, journal articles, and media articles. His books include Confronting Gun Violence in America, Enough, and most recently, Carnage, Preventing Mass Shootings in America. Dr. Gabor, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Cass. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to set up my slide presentation, and we'll get ready to get going here. There we go. And thank you, Cass, again for the invitation. And I'd like to thank the wider audience for tuning in today. I'm going to be talking today about the long-term and more recent trends in mass shootings, some of the factors accounting for the concerning trends that we're seeing here in the United States, the different categories of mass shootings, and some solutions or different way of looking at solutions than perhaps you have seen. The discussion will in part be based on my work over the last year, where I examined over 1,000 mass shootings in the United States in 2019 and 2020. So it's quite a large number. I'm sure you'll appreciate and agree. Now, first, I'd like to start by saying that definitions matter. They are highly consequential in this area. Depending on the source that you rely on, in 2020, we had as few as 2 mass shootings in the United States, or as many as over 600. So you will appreciate that this type of disparity will create considerable confusion among the public. So it's one issue that needs to be rectified. We're sending contradictory messages out regarding the number of mass shootings and whether the problem is getting worse. So what's going on? Where Mother Jones magazine, for example, which has been tracking mass shootings going back to the 1980s, considers a mass shooting as an incident in which 3 or more people are killed, but their focus is very restrictive because they're focused primarily on random shootings in public. And they exclude gang-related violence, domestic violence, crime-related violence, and so forth. So it's a very limited definition, very narrow definition. The Gun Violence Archive, on the other hand, which is the source that I've relied on, is more inclusive. And they consider a mass shooting as an incident in which 4 or more people are shot, excluding the perpetrator. And they include domestic, crime-related, gang-related shootings, and different locations and different motives. Now, one of the things that's been disconcerting to me with this disparity, you might say, in definitions, is that I read, for example, an op-ed penned by one of the groups that's tracking these shootings, and they were saying, and this was in the Los Angeles Times, that there were just 2 shootings last year, that there was a lull during the pandemic. There was a lull in 2020, and I'm not seeing that at all. In fact, as you'll see shortly, I saw an explosion in mass shootings last year, in particular last summer. Now, I favor this more inclusive definition where there isn't a minimum number of people killed. It's 4 or more people shot at one general location. Because even non-fatal firearm injuries can be very serious and life-threatening and life-altering. In addition, mass shootings, when there are a number of individuals who've been shot in one general location, are traumatic to victims, bystanders, and the community, regardless of the number shot, regardless of the motives. And just to give an illustration of what we exclude if one has this more restrictive definition. For example, in Gilroy, California, at a garlic festival in 2019, 2 people were shot, 17 were wounded. 2 people were killed, 17 were wounded, and that wouldn't qualify as a mass shooting, according to a more restrictive definition. Now, some people ask, why study mass shootings at all, since they account for just approximately 2% of all gun deaths? And my response to that is that mass shootings have a very broad impact on the community and on society, whether we're talking about the frequent rants in public, in malls, in movie theaters, and so on, or whether we're talking about those shootings that are sometimes lower casualty shootings, but which occur repeatedly in certain urban neighborhoods and terrorize those communities. So they have a broad impact that's out of proportion to the so-called body count. And another indication of the broad impact, following the mass shootings in Dayton and El Paso in 2019, August of 2019, a national poll was taken in the US, which found that 1/3 of Americans said that they avoid certain places and events due to fear. So that's quite substantial, as you would appreciate. And just give you another example of how the victims of mass shootings don't merely include the direct victims, with bystanders, witnesses, and first responders. There was a cafeteria shooting back in 1991 in Killeen, Texas. A fellow drove through the window of a cafeteria and opened fire, killed more than 20 people, wounded another close to 20 people. A health team showed up at the scene and interviewed over 130 witnesses, first responders, and so forth. And they found that 3 in 10 of people who had witnessed this event, none of them were shot. They qualified they met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And even 3 years later, they followed up these people, and 2 in 10 still showed the symptoms, if you wish, of post-traumatic stress disorder. Very few individuals who were at the scene showed no symptoms at all. So again, we can't just look at individuals who are the direct victims, but rather individuals who are witnesses, and sometimes even the wider society, as we've seen, for example, following the Parkland, Florida school shooting. Kids have been terrified to go to school, and they're afraid. In fact, an American Psychological Association survey says that the #1 source of stress for young people aged between 15 to 21 is the fear of getting caught in the middle of a mass or school shooting. I guess that's why some of the Parkland kids call themselves the mass shooting generation. Now, I just want to say a few words about trends, and I've got something up. I triggered this slide a little prematurely. Just want to say that we've seen steadily over the last half century an increase in the number and lethality of mass shootings. 2/3 of the deadliest mass shootings over the last 70 years have occurred in 2007. So we're seeing this problem becoming increasingly more serious, more fatalities each year, a larger number of mass shootings each year. Of course, it's not perfectly linear, but quite a gradual increase and a continual increase in mass shootings and in lethality of them, despite the fact that the emergency response and emergency transportation to hospitals and the presence of trauma, level 1 trauma centers and so forth have increased over the years. And despite the fact that surgeons are becoming better at saving individuals with gunshot wounds, there's been about a 5% improvement in survival rates from gunshot wounds due to lessons learned on the battlefields of Afghanistan. 5% equates to thousands of people each year. So despite these medical advances, we continue to see increases in the number of people who die from mass shootings. So we might conjecture that had these improvements not taken place, we might be facing even a more dire situation today with regard to this problem. Now, I'd just like to show you some recent trends. So this is from the Gun Violence Archive. And you can see that between 2014 and 2020, the number of mass shootings have more than doubled. Last year, they really exploded, especially in the summer as states were beginning to open up following the lockdowns, pandemic-related lockdowns. And unfortunately, I have to report that as of May 10th of this year, we are well ahead of last year's pace. We have had almost double the mass shootings as of May 10th this year, as opposed to the record-setting 2020. Now, I'm not sure if that will be sustained. Last year, we saw almost 3 mass shootings a day on average in the summer in the US. So hopefully we won't be seeing that again, but we're ahead of last year's pace, which is indeed troubling. Now, there are at least 2 factors that I believe are responsible for the surge last summer. Once again, the openings from the COVID-19 following the lockdowns. Schools were closed, young people were out of school, out of work, not having income. There was more stresses on individuals. And this disproportionately hits communities that are already under stress, where there are already issues with employment and youth employment and so forth. Young people are stuck at home. And we saw even shutdowns in anti-violence programs and counseling programs for people who are at risk of gun violence. So we saw quite a few, sometimes illegal gatherings in public, very large gatherings at which shootings occurred. Some of these were spontaneous, others were targeted. So the COVID-19 pandemic had something to do with the surge, because the surge we see every summer was exceeded about 3-fold last summer. And then there was the racial reckoning and strife that occurred pursuant to the shooting of George Floyd on May 25th. So these occurred concurrently, the beginning of the opening up from the lockdowns and the shooting of George Floyd and its aftermath. And as we saw in Ferguson, Missouri, it's now called the Ferguson effect, back in 2014, following the shooting of Michael Brown. There were protests, there was a great deal of rage in the African-American community. And what happens following these police-involved killings, when they're perceived as being excessive force, and certainly George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, because I can use that term now, as former Officer Chauvin has been convicted of second-degree murder, is that it's what happens following these incidents is that there's even more legal cynicism. There's even more mistrust of the police and a greater tendency for citizens and affected communities not to bring in the police when there's a quarrel and when there's conflict, and to settle scores themselves. There's more, as they call it, street justice. So we often see more violence following these incidents, and that was certainly the case last year. Now, when I've examined the 1,029 cases that were identified in 2019 and 2020, I found 5 broad categories, and you can break these down further. But these are the 5 categories that I've identified. There's the resentful shooter, who basically lashes out at society or targets a specific setting like a workplace or a school. These are individuals who harbor resentments, sometimes for a long period of time. They may be mentally ill, but that's usually just a small fraction of these individuals who have a serious mental illness. Then there are targeted shootings and ongoing disputes between individuals or groups. Another category are spontaneous disputes that erupt at a bar, at a party, or some other gathering. Then there's a felony-related type of mass shooting. These are very few, where, for example, individuals will break into a home, rob the occupants, and then kill them so that they won't face retaliation, and they're basically killing the witnesses. And finally, there are the ideologically driven shooters. So we saw the white supremacist, or the individual with white supremacist forms of sympathies, who committed the shooting in the El Paso Walmart. And there was a couple back in 2015 in San Bernardino, California, that were committed to Islamic militancy and martyrdom. What I found over the last couple of years is that by far the most common type of mass shootings were categories 2 and 3, the targeted shootings and ongoing disputes and the spontaneous disputes. And this is consistent with what we've known in criminology since 1960, that most homicides are due to, and often most assaults and aggravated assaults are due to some form of dispute, whether it's over money, honor, jealousy, domestic related. These tend to dominate. Whereas it's the first type, the resentful shooters, and to some degree, the rare ideologically driven shootings that receive the most media attention. And that's problematic because people are misinformed regarding what the typical mass shooting looks like. Now, because there are different motives, different locations of shootings, different attributes of shooters, no, there's no one size fits all type of solution. However, I'd like to just present to you an approach. I'll call it more of an approach to looking at mass shootings and looking at solutions to mass shootings. So first, I believe in the case of many types of mass shootings, we need to look at social economic factors underlying the mass violence. So I guess in the public health terminology, we might use the term primary prevention. Others use the term upstream factors. These are larger social and economic factors that underlie the mass violence. And as you'll see from some data that I'll be showing you shortly, that there is no ignoring these factors. Then we also have to do a better job of interrupting violence already present in the community, because there is a lot, especially in some urban areas, of vendetta-like conflicts where there's the cycle of retaliation that takes place between groups and individuals. And there are ways to break that cycle, and I will address that shortly as well. We, of course, cannot ignore the weapons that enable mass violence and need to consider further restricting them, if not banning the weapons that are implicated in many of these shootings. I guess, again, public health specialists might use the term a vector, that the weapon is a vector of violence. It transfers or transforms conflict, often into mortality. And then we can't ignore the role of the media in producing a contagion effect, and I'll be addressing that as well shortly. But first, I'd like to bring your attention to economic factors. And I came upon a very interesting way of measuring the economic well-being of communities, because usually we use traditional indicators like poverty and unemployment, and that's fine. But there's a group called the Economic Innovation Group, which also look at things such as job growth or negative growth in the case of some communities, and look at business closings or openings and how a community is doing with regard to these things, as well as residential vacancies and the like, which capture not only the current well-being or the extent to which a community is distressed at the present time, but they also capture the prospects. How hopeful is that community? Or are they in a situation where there's little hope for young people growing up, few opportunities available? So I want to bring your attention to 10 cities. These are the 10 cities that in absolute numbers have the largest percentage, I should say, largest number of people who live in distressed communities. But they vary greatly if you look at the first column in terms of the percentage of the population living in distressed communities. So we have Detroit, where 99% of the population lives in a distressed community. Once again, a community high on poverty, high in unemployment, where you have negative job growth. You have a very negative situation in terms of the closings of businesses. And this is before the pandemic. This is not included. This data was available before the pandemic. So in Detroit, you have 99% of the population all the way living in distressed zip codes, whereas in New York City, it's 15.9%. And as you see, as you go down this list, so increasingly, you're going to communities that are more prosperous and a lower number of people living in distressed zip codes. So I looked at the homicide rate of these cities to see if there was a relationship between the percentage of the population that lives in the distressed communities and the homicide rate, as well as the mass shootings per million people. And you see that while there are a few small exceptions, and there are certainly other factors that influence the homicide rate and influence the number of mass shootings, that we see quite consistently, if we look at the first 5 cities from Detroit through to Chicago, you have a fairly substantial proportion of the population living in a distressed zip code. And you also see that these have much higher homicide rates than the lower 5. And they also have much higher rate of mass shootings per million people. So, and you go down to Los Angeles and New York, which may, in terms of absolute numbers, because they're the largest cities in the country, have a large number of people in distressed communities. But percentage-wise, in New York, for example, 85% of the population does not live in a distressed zip code. So they have a much lower homicide rate, a much lower rate of mass shootings than places like Detroit, Memphis, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. So it's such a strong relationship that it's very hard to ignore the impact of not just poverty, but the extent to which the local situation is hopeful, or alternatively seems hopeless to individuals growing up in those communities. Now, here's another way to look at this. I compared the 10 most distressed communities in the United States, Detroit, Cleveland, Newark, and so on, with the most prosperous, San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, etc., and found that the homicide rate in the most distressed cities was 9 times that of the most prosperous ones. So it just reinforces what criminologists certainly have known for over 100 years, that economic inequality and serious poverty, and in this case also hopelessness due to the negative objective situation of a city, plays a major role in violence, and we simply can't ignore that. Now, there are certainly other social factors, upstream social factors that are important, one of them being the soaring depression and suicide rates among young people. And I don't have time to go into this at great length, but there's certainly much evidence that young people are tethered less to their communities than they used to be, less engaged in political and community activities in the community, have fewer friends, spend more time alone, more time on these personal electronic devices, and so forth. And obviously, most suicidal and depressed young people don't even contemplate committing a mass shooting. However, a small percentage of impressionable individuals may be susceptible to extreme actions that express their resentments and gain attention. I want to say a word or two, as discussed earlier, on violence interruption programs. These are programs that identify those at the greatest risk of violence, intervene in conflicts, and link individuals who are at risk of violence to services. So these programs, one name for one of the programs is Cure Violence out of Chicago. And what they do is recruit individuals who have a lot of street cred, so to speak. Many of them have been former gang members. And when somebody's shot, suppose they're in the hospital, they will go and meet with them and try to convince them, first of all, not to retaliate, and try to convince their friends and family members not to retaliate, because as I mentioned before, these cycles of violence, these vendetta type conflicts are very common. But they also try to connect them with services that can assist them, such as whether it's job counseling, helping them with employment, helping them with a drug problem, and so forth. So this initiative, which has been fairly well evaluated so far, is something that's catching on in more and more cities in the US. Now, I mentioned the third broad category of mass shootings, third broad category of ways to tackle mass shootings is dealing with the weapons that enable these shootings. And just for example, in the Dayton, Ohio, 2019 mass shooting, 26 people were shot in 30 seconds. So even though there were police on the scene, this was the entertainment district, the Oregon district in Dayton, they couldn't respond fast enough because the AR-15 rifle did its job, and the fellow had a 100-round magazine that fed this rifle. My study found that assault rifles were 10 times as likely to be used in a mass shooting as in a conventional homicide. Once again, illustrating that these firearms enable mass shootings. They increase the casualties, and there have been other studies that have shown the same thing. And in fact, if we look at many of the deadliest shootings in recent years, the shooter used an AR-15 style weapon or an AK-47 style weapon. Now, aside from addressing military grade weapons, and I think the folks at Hopkins have written extensively about this issue, we have to look at licensing in the United States. We have a background check system, which in my view is severely flawed. Not just flawed because there's a loophole where people can buy privately and not undergo a background check, but as well, there's so many other flaws in this system, which is basically a 2-minute check where the dealer contacts the FBI and a very superficial check is done to see if the individual has had a conviction for a criminal offense, for a felony specifically. And there is so much data that's not being passed on from the state to the federal government that this background check is highly inadequate. So I'm a big proponent of the type of licensing systems that exist in other countries, where there are reference checks, where there's mandatory training in the use of firearms, in the understanding of the appropriate uses of lethal force, where there are interviews for every aspiring gun buyer needs to undergo an interview with law enforcement. And then this license needs to be renewed every 3 to 5 years. You know, in Florida, you have a concealed weapons permitting system, which in my view is a farce. Apologize for that term, but I've gone through the course myself. And a person can renew online this concealed weapons permit without meeting with anybody. So not even going through a course or anybody. And we have 2.1 million people here in Florida who have concealed weapons permits. We also need to look at red flag laws. They need to be implemented widely so that guns can be seized from individuals who are seen by family members or people who know that individual to be a risk to themselves or to others. Here again, we just need to look back to the Indianapolis FedEx facility shooter back in March. And this individual's mother was so concerned about his behavior, about his mental health, that she contacted the FBI. He was thoroughly investigated by the FBI, but there was no effort made to seize his firearms. And we saw the result. He bought 2 assault rifles after meeting with the FBI, and the rest is history, unfortunately. Finally, I'd just like to say a few words about responsible media practices, because these can slow the spread of mass shootings. We've seen in relation to airline hijackings and suicides, especially suicides among youth, they can cluster in time, and one can beget another. Where there have been recent studies that show that following a mass shooting, for 13 days, we're at greater risk of a repeat, of an additional mass shooting. So the media need to be very careful in releasing a great deal of information as to the motives of the individual, their methods, because impressionable individuals can identify with past shooters and imitate their methods. For example, if we focus on an individual who's faced bullying and we dwell on that subject, then individuals out there who've also faced bullying in school might take this as some cue to try to resolve the situation in the same way through a mass shooting. So I was very pleased to see that recently the Columbia University School of Journalism convened a meeting with reporters who report on gun violence and mass shootings. And they released a series of principles that they resolve to follow in the future. And one of it involves trying to understand more deeply this issue and reporting on it, allocating sufficient resources to report on mass shootings less superficially and not to focus on the more sensational aspects of them. So we'll see, but it would be good to see us focus on more than just the body count and interviewing those who've been terrorized minutes after the shooting, witnesses and so forth, and focus more on how we can deal with these mass shootings, focus more on solutions as opposed to the more superficial, sensational aspects of them. So with this, I'd just like to put up here a little information on my book, Carnage. I've been very fortunate to receive some good reviews, including from Dr. Crifasi, and I invite you to take a look at the book, and I certainly welcome feedback. I'm on Facebook and welcome interaction with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would just remind folks, if you have questions, to feel free to put them in the Q&A. Dr. Gabor, did you have other thoughts, or are you ready to transition to the discussion?
I'm ready to transition to the discussion. I guess I'll take off the presentation now.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. So first off, I just wanted to acknowledge the importance of what you said in the beginning about definitions, right? Being in a school of public health and thinking about how we define the problem. If we aren't clear on what our definition is, then we could be having very different conversations about the potential solutions. And so I just wanted to thank you for starting off on that note.
Just if I can intervene for a minute,
please.
Just reinforcing that what the different definitions provide, and in my view, a more restrictive definition not only undercounts the number of mass shootings, but it provides a distorted view in terms of where shootings occur and the type of shootings that occur. So if you have also not just looking at random shootings, but all mass shootings or all incidents in which 4 or more people are shot, you're going to pick up on those shootings, the vast majority which are occurring in some urban communities, and repeatedly terrorize those urban communities. So we might say that with a more restrictive type of definition, we're focusing on cases that often occur in the suburbs, where you have often white people who are affected and who are the shooters, and we're missing a lot that are affecting and devastating certain communities of color.
That's great. Thank you. So there was a comment in the chat, a question sort of related to when you were discussing the impact of police violence, and the commenter raised that George Floyd wasn't shot, he was suffocated by police. But I was wondering if you could just reflect on, police violence doesn't have to use a gun to impact gun violence in a community, and if you wanted to share any thoughts on that.
Well, absolutely. Well, first of all, there's a continuum of force that the police can use, and lethal force is or ought to be the last option, and that was a particularly egregious case. But one thing that we found is that, for example, in the city of Milwaukee a number of years ago, there was a brutal attack by the police of an African-American man at a party. These were police officers who were off duty. And following that, calls to police over the next 6 months went down by 20%. So indicating the impact of these acts of brutality on the population, but even in populations that are already very cynical about the police and have a great mistrust, that becomes magnified. And then those communities tend to turn inward and handle their own problems. And we see more people taking the law into their own hands when they have a conflict, rather than calling in the police and dealing with the conflict through the justice system. So I'm not sure if I answered your entire question, but there is a continuum of force. And this is the problem also when firearms are used in conflicts by ordinary citizens, that we know, because we hear this mantra from the gun lobby and so forth, guns don't kill, people do. I think both are important, but firearms certainly, when they're present in a conflict, raise the stakes considerably, increase the probability that people will end up being killed. I think when you compare guns with knives, historically, we've seen in research, there's about a 3 to 5-fold chance that an individual will be killed in a conflict where a gun is involved and a gun is present. So the weapon does make a major difference. And it's why gun carrying is so problematic for me, because we talk about the United States as being an outlier. And yes, we are in terms of the numbers of the guns. We have about 120 at last count guns for every 100 people. But equally important is that we're a global outlier in terms of the gun carrying in the United States. It's so prevalent. It's becoming increasingly prevalent, and people are carrying guns without any training whatsoever, and frequently without any knowledge of when it's appropriate to use lethal force. So firearms are dangerous, whether they're in the hands of, or potentially dangerous, whether they're in the hands of civilians or the police. They raise the stakes.
Thank you. So the next question is asking how we can address the cultural entitlements of guns in America.
Yeah, well, where researchers are trying to do, that's a good point. There is still, regardless of the fact that we are a global outlier, there's an image of the United States as there's a universal gun lust in this country. And in fact, there might have been a little reversal in 2020 because of the pandemic and the insurrection, if you want to call it that, on January 6th. But there has been a long-term decline in gun ownership in the United States as a percentage of the population. Fewer hunters, increasing urbanization of the population, fewer veterans coming back. Veterans were often introduced to guns through their military service. So the majority of American adults do not own a gun. Now that's increased a little bit last year, probably because of pandemic and other related fears. Now, I would argue, first of all, that the premise that we have a universal gun culture in the United States is wrong. But I accept the question that among probably 35% of the population, who are gun owners, there's a relatively small percentage that own arsenals, which is one of the problems. Is there's a growing concentration of guns in a smaller number of hands. And how do we deal with it? Well, I guess what we try to do in research, and I think we're seeing more research in the last few years, more funding becoming available. I'm happy to see the new administration also infusing some cash in this area. Is we have to basically lay out the reality of gun violence, and that the dangers of what a former NRA head back in the 1930s called the promiscuous carrying of guns, that there is danger associated with gun carrying, especially when people are not properly vetted and trained. So what I do and what the people at Hopkins do is primarily we do the research, but equally important, of course, is try to communicate this research in a way that can be easily digested by members of the public so that they learn the dangers associated with gun carrying and gun ownership, and the importance of responsible ownership by those who do carry and own firearms.
Thank you. So there were two sort of related questions looking at the role of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in mass shootings, and whether you've explored that or what you know from the literature on that.
Well, we hear some problematic data from surveys that a study came out a few years ago, finding that over 4 million women in the United States have faced threats or been shot at, so threats with a gun, or shot at by an intimate partner. I think it was 1.5 million who were actually shot at. We know that the presence of guns where abuse is present can raise the likelihood that the victim of abuse will be killed tremendously. Some studies show as much as 12 times the likelihood where there's the presence of firearms and abuse at the same time. So it becomes important to look at not just red flag laws, but other mechanisms like gun violence, restraining orders, and so forth, where we ensure that people who are at risk of abuse do not have access to firearms, or people who have a history of domestic violence do not have access to firearms, and where somebody shows an abusive pattern, that we have mechanisms in place that allow the law to seize their firearms. And so we're seeing more, for example, red flag laws currently that address this issue.
And I think it goes back to the point you made in the beginning and the first question I asked about definitions. If we exclude domestic violence related mass shootings, we're missing an opportunity for intervention. There's new work coming out suggesting, as much as 50 or 60% of mass shootings could have some domestic violence component. So I think you're right. We need to exercise the tools that we have in place, both for mass shootings, but for other forms of violence, to make sure that we're disarming individuals who are at great risk.
Exactly. And, we have those hybrid shootings as well, including one of the first mass shootings in America's modern history, if you will, back in 1966, the Texas Tower shooting, where the shooter first murdered his wife, murdered his mother, and then went on the tower and randomly shot people on the University of Texas at Austin campus. So you have those situations as well, where an individual begins by murdering members of their family and sometimes assassinating their entire family, and then moving on to commit a mass shooting in public. So these are definitely concerning events, and they do account. I found a smaller percentage, but still troubling, because again, it depends on every town. For gun safety uses a different definition, and certainly domestic mass shootings tend to have a higher fatality count than other ones on average, because people, when they start shooting members of their own family, that includes children, and they have easy access to them. And sometimes you see these horrific cases like we saw recently, where 5, 6, 7 people are murdered.
Thank you. So a slightly different direction for this question. A listener is interested in your thoughts on the benefits of gun tracing and the current law, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, that can protect gun manufacturers from lawsuits, if you have any thoughts on those.
Yes, in particular, the PLCAA, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, has been with us since 2005, and it offers unprecedented immunity to the gun industry in terms of lawsuits. Now, why are lawsuits important? Because, for example, suppose a gun that was manufactured by company A is used in a mass shooting. When it comes to other consumer products, the victims or the families would have recourse to suing those manufacturers and consequently holding them accountable. And one can imagine that if in one of these major mass shootings, whether it's El Paso or Las Vegas or Parkland, the victims either had a class action suit or individually sued the manufacturer. A manufacturer could go bankrupt, or at least it would be very costly to that gun maker and to the dealers and sellers and so forth. And consequently, this might lead them to reconsider selling and manufacturing these products. So this would be an alternative to the difficult policy of trying to confiscate or have a large-scale buyback and banning all, say, assault-style weapons. This is a market-driven solution where you would exact, by repealing this law, the PLCAA, you would exact a high cost from companies and dealers, and consequently, they might reconsider producing and selling these products. And so I am a very strong proponent of repealing this legislation, which, as I say, gives unprecedented immunity to the gun industry. Just another related matter is guns, to my knowledge, are virtually the only consumer product in the United States of about 15,000 products that are exempt from oversight by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. This is the commission that looks at the safety of different consumer products, from mattresses to hair dryers. I think we've had 22 injuries in the United States over the last 20 years from hair dryers, but they still are overseen by the Consumer Products Association, which solicits information from people who've been injured, collects data, and will make changes or require changes of products if they're shown to be dangerous. If you can imagine a potentially lethal weapon such as a gun is exempt due to a congressional law. Well, laws are congressional, but due to an act of Congress back in the 1970s that explicitly exempted the gun industry from any consumer oversight.
I'm glad you raised that. I was actually going to ask that as a follow-up question to the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, but you beat me to it. It's such a thorough response. Thank you. A question that, and this may be the last one, we may have time for one more. Thinking about your background in criminal justice, and others have, public health or medical, or, whatever their different perspectives could be, faith-based, how can we bring together all the stakeholders who are interested in this, or what venue perhaps may exist to enable a more comprehensive discussion about this issue?
I think that's a wonderful question and so important, because one of the things that's really troubled me, we had the Parkland shooting almost in my backyard, about 3/4 of an hour from my home. And I find that people affected by that shooting, whether they're family members, activists, and others, we're all seem to be working in our own silos. And I wrote an article back in the 1990s advocating for criminologists to pay more attention to the work being done by public health specialists. So I very strongly favor, I think we all bring criminologists, public health, medical people, other social scientists bring a lot to the table. And I would love to see us collaborate. For example, some of the research methodologies used by public health people, epidemiologists, are of value to criminologists. And I think we bring some value as well in our understanding of patterns in crime. And I would love to see a summit of some sort. And who better to do it than the folks at Johns Hopkins, who are well-resourced, very organized, very professional. So I would love to see such a meeting and love to attend that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll certainly see. We've pulled them together in the past on different topics, particularly after the Sandy Hook shooting. So maybe that'll be in our future. To follow up on that question and what you were just mentioning, do you have any specific actions that physicians could engage in to help reduce violence, and what role they might have?
I think, as pediatricians know, and public health specialists are aware that doctors are frontline, they meet with many families, and because even young children can be in harm's way, I've seen with regard to whether they're accidents, even mass shootings, where children as young as 1 month of age have been shot, that making all homeowners and gun owners aware that of the dangers the dangers posed by firearms and ways that people can protect themselves. You know, there's an interesting program here in Florida run by the Broward County League of Women Voters. I think it's spreading around the country. They have a Lock It Up program where they're trying to reach as many families as possible and educating people, and including health practitioners about ways that people can easily secure firearms, easily and inexpensively. This particular program, they don't charge at all. They're giving away locking devices to families. And if we can only convince people to secure those firearms, and I understand that many people today, an increasing number, are securing firearms for the purpose of the personal safety and personal protection. But there are ways of locking up firearms and yet being able to deploy them quickly if necessary. So these types of programs are very useful in reaching people at the front lines. But I'm all for encouraging pediatricians to work with families, to ask them those questions. And we had this troubling law that you're probably aware of in Florida for a while, where doctors were prohibited from discussing with their patients and asking them whether they had guns, where guns were kept, and so forth. It was argued that this is the first step to confiscation of firearms. Fortunately, that law has been struck down. And so I think frontline personnel should probe this issue, because we've had far too many tragedies and far more. There was a study in Florida done a few years ago that found that there were far more children shot than we were aware of through health records, maybe 3 or 4 times more children being shot than we were aware of through official records. So it's a real concerning area that needs to be addressed. Absolutely.
I appreciate your point that we often forget, which is with the right of gun ownership comes the responsibility, to safely secure and store those guns. Dr. Gabor, thank you so much for your time today. It was a fascinating presentation and your time to answer questions. I wish we had more time so that we could have gotten through more of them. But thank you so much, everyone. As a reminder, the presentation is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. Keep an eye out on Twitter. And just thank you again. We appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks, Cass.